Psychologist and voluntary hero Jordan Peterson released his book 12 Rules for Life. It became an instant bestseller, a guideline filled with stories about how to confront the chaos in life, overcoming tragedy and malevolence. Especially young men are drawn to his message of what he calls hope. In the face of polarization and identity politics, Peterson explains how we should cherish peace as the exception and be responsible human beings. You also say in the book you can't talk about everything. You have to be precise in the problem that you're trying to address in the world. So I was struggling a little bit with that. So like what should I tell my friends, for example, when I try to tell them about the rules? So how can I compromise, like or size it down? Because it's so much.
Well, I'm trying, first of all, to outline the landscape in which people live. Mm-hmm. And I think the landscape we live in is best conceptualized in the way that fiction conceptualizes it. We live in a world of chaos and order. Mm-hmm. So that would be one division. And another division would be that we live in a world of good and evil. Okay. And it's the world of chaos and order. You might say the consequence of that is that our lives are tragic, right? They're short. We're bounded. Our lives are short and tragic. And that's a big problem. It's the big problem. It would be the big problem if there wasn't another big problem, and that's the problem of malevolence. Mm-hmm. And so we live in a world, being is tragic and it has a malevolent aspect. Okay, so that's the problem. Mm-hmm. And then all other problems it's the bottom. It's the bottom. That's the problem. All other problems are manifestations of those problems. Mm-hmm. Okay, so, and then you might say, well, is there a way of solving that base problem? And that's what religious stories are attempting to do. They're saying, well, we live in a world that's bounded and finite and tainted by malevolence. How do you conduct yourself in such a place? Mm-hmm. Well, that's what the book is about. Yeah. At the deepest level. And one is that the best antidote to malevolence happens to be truth, but that also happens to be the best antidote to tragedy. Mm-hmm. So, and then the question is, well, whether or not that actually constitutes a real antidote.
When I talk to friends or family and I tell them, well, if we don't stop behaving this way, if we don't stop lying, if we don't become more truthful about what's happening, then this could end in genocide. Mm-hmm. And they just look like, what are you talking about?
Well, it always does. I mean,
so it's
not even a shock. Much. Yeah, I know, it shouldn't even be a shock because it's the natural state of affairs. That always happens. Mm. You know, we also think that there was something that was in some sense limited to, well, let's say what happened in Germany in the 20th century, but it's not limited to that at all. It happens everywhere.
Berlin, where I live, it's full of monuments, from the Holocaust monuments, full of museums with all,
I know.
Every
never
street corner.
Never forget.
But still, it's not something that we have internalized somehow, that this is real.
You can't remember what you don't understand, right? No matter how hard you try. Yeah. And the issue is, what does it mean to remember? I know what it means to remember, like technically. If you make a mistake and you've represented it properly in your memory, you don't make the same mistake again. That's actually what memory is for, right? Because you think, well, why do you remember the past? Well, there's two reasons. One is to repeat things you did well that worked out, and to not repeat things you did badly. The purpose of memory is to do that. It's not to represent the world. No. I mean, it is, but only insofar as...
To do what works, basically.
And to not do what doesn't work. Yeah, exactly. It's to bring the successes into the future and leave the failures behind. Okay. Right? You say, well, we're going to remember the Holocaust. Okay, well, what are you going to remember?
So humans cannot have like a collective memory that they use to... like a warning signal.
Oh, sure, we do that too, but we have to formulate it properly, you know. So one question, a question, and this question that's plagued me forever, I would say, is, well, what is it that we're supposed to have learned from what happened in Germany in the 1930s? What do we learn? That there was something wrong with Germans? Is that the lesson? That's not really a very useful lesson. That was isolated to that time and place, that it was the consequence of following pathological leadership, that it was a consequence of economic turmoil. I mean, there's all sorts of things you could learn from it. My sense is that what needs to be learned from it is that that's what we're like.
So it's not culture, it's not a country, it's not the German, the Dutch, it's...
Chimpanzees do it. This is the great discovery of Jane Goodall, right? She found that the chimps raided, and when they, juveniles in particular, and when they're out on the borders of their territory doing their patrols, and they came across chimps from another troop, they'd tear them to pieces. It's like, well, okay, that's not human. This is deeper than, it's even deeper than human, this.
Wasn't she also reluctant to bring
absolutely.
to bring that
Yeah, she was shocked. She was shocked. Well, for a bunch of reasons. I mean, first of all, she was properly cautious because she thought that human interactions with the chimpanzees might have interfered with their natural behavior. And that was such a shocking finding. She was unwilling to publish it. Yeah. But I also think it violated her noble savage assumption, that the state of nature was basically good. And I mean, lots of people think the reason that human beings are corrupt because they're socialized to be corrupt. That the reason we're warlike, for example, is because we're socialized improperly. And I mean, you can certainly socialize people to be more or less warlike. But this is a way deeper problem than mere socialization. Even though socialization is very, very important. So she was very hesitant to publish it, but she did, and it's become clear in the decades following that was normative behavior for chimpanzees. So, but it's also partly the fact that we have ourselves backwards. We always ask stupid questions like, why are we anxious? That's a stupid question. The real question is, how is it ever that anyone is ever calm, even for a microsecond? Right, and it's the case. Why are we aggressive? It's like, no, how is it that we can now and then be peaceful? That's the question. So we have these things backwards often.
So you're saying we don't understand ourselves and we can't remember what we don't understand?
Yeah, you can't remember what you don't understand. It's in some sense, to try to remember what you don't understand is to be in a state of trauma. And I would say that would characterize the Germans.
What is your impression of the Dutchmen? What did they tell you yesterday?
They tell me the same thing wherever I go. It's the same thing all the time. I've been watching your videos for, a year and a half, whatever. Sometimes they say, well, I came because of the political, controversy, but then I started listening to what you were saying, and then I got hooked on it, and I've been listening to like 100 hours, and it's completely straightened out my life. They just say that over and over and over. Yeah, well, one guy, British guy, he told me the strangest story. He came up, he had a heavy metal T-shirt on, and so I asked him about it, and he said he was a fan of this band that makes songs out of stories, takes fiction, works of fiction, and turns them into songs, and that he's been reading a fair bit as a consequence of that. But he said that he was in a really dark place, and he had watched a clip that someone had made from one of my videos. I don't remember what the clip was, but it was only a few minutes long. And he said it just helped him. It just fixed him right up. And then he said he had a friend who was in the same boat, feeling the same way. So he sent him the clip, and it had exactly the same effect on him. It's hope, eh? Well, the thing is, people have to know the archetypal stories. And we know half the archetypal story in the modern world. We know the life is short and tragic and people are malevolent archetypal story. Well, Jesus, that's a rough one, man. If you don't know the counterposition to that, then you have nowhere to go. No. And it's even worse and the counterposition is the story of the voluntary hero. That's the counterposition. And if the story of the voluntary hero, the person who will confront the corrupt society and confront chaos and the unknown, if that's also become contaminated with the idea of malevolence, like your heroic action is actually adding to the catastrophe of the world, well, then you're just done. What are you going to do? There's nowhere to go. Your best instincts are thwarted. And so, partly what I've been suggesting to young men is that their best instincts are actually good, including the ones that have been damned, aggressiveness, competition, all that sort of thing. It's like That's good,
so
not
the
bad.
instinct to be responsible and to make a life and have a family.
Yeah, well, that's sort of a meta instinct in some
Okay,
sense. That
yeah.
like the instincts, the ones that you don't need to learn, are maybe the aggression, the tendency to aggression, and the tendency towards sexual attraction, and all those things are so basic. But the instinct to be responsible is slightly higher in the cognitive hierarchy, and it has to be catalyzed.
Yeah.
It has to be catalyzed by initiation. It has to be catalyzed by stories, stories in particular. Say, well, how do you cope with this landscape? It's like, stand the hell up and get on with it. But deeper, it's not just an injunction to behave properly.
But it is also something that the group has to give you permission for somehow. If people tell you that you should be responsible and that you can handle it, that works as a...
that's a good observation. You need to hear it.
You need to hear it.
Yes, you need to hear it.
Yeah.
That's the thing. You need to hear it at least once.
Yeah, yeah. From your teacher, from your parents,
someone that you respect.
Yeah.
And the thing is, as long as you're vaguely healthy, if you hear it once, credibly, then that's enough.
I remember from my school time, there was this one teacher there. There was one teacher 5 years later, and I just moved from these moments of inspiration and people that would see something in me, which I could move forward with.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So
those are mentors.
That's how you build,
and they encourage you.
Yeah. How can I get women to engage and to listen to Jordan Peterson?
I think there are many women who are. There aren't as many. The proportion isn't as high. It probably doesn't matter. I think there's enough, and I think so. And the fact that men are listening more, first of all, perhaps is only temporary. But I think I don't think it matters. And maybe women are doing whatever they need to do. It's possible. Maybe they aren't. Maybe it isn't as necessary for them for some reason.
That they have this stress all the time, working, being a parent. Yeah, women.
Oh yeah, it could be. Yeah. They might be. They're preoccupied.
But they're not speaking their mind yet about it. It's very close. It's very like a taboo. You have to be all these things, and when women are together, they tend to reaffirm that all the time. I'm working really hard, and I'm picking up the kids, and I'm trying to make it all work. But they never say, why are we doing this?
Right.
Why are we doing? They judge each other if they just have the kids and don't work. They judge you if you work and don't have kids.
See, women in my clinical practice tell me that all the time.
Yeah.
That's probably why they come talk to me.
Yeah.
And it's not a biased sample. I mean, these are women who are very...
It's not something...
Well, they come and say, it isn't obvious to me that I can do all of this. Like, I've seen some women in my practice who are unbelievably competent, and so they're juggling a high-powered career, so that's like 70 hours a week, or 80 hours a week. Flat out work, and they're off to the gym and they're taking care of their kids, but they don't have a second to spare, and it isn't obvious that it's maintainable, that high level of multidimensional attainment, and it's not also obvious because of that it's desirable, but so I think that we're in a period where the cultural ideal for women is career and family. Career's hard enough, family's hard enough. The intersection between them two is very, very difficult. And doubts around that, are to be expressed privately. You can't have a public conversation about it. No. You can't say... No. There was a recent paper published, I tweeted it the other day, showing that, I hope I get this right, that women who are with their children, women who have children who are with their children full-time are happier. And that's particularly the case if they gave up a good career to do it. Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what everyone would like to believe.
Yes.
And so, but it's also, so it might be in some sense that the problems that women have are unspeakable. That might be it.
Is it possible to get the left to understand what they're doing is actually against their own interests at this point? I'm not talking about people that are genuinely liberal and want to do the right thing.
I'm not sure it is against their own interests. It depends on what their interests are. Like if their interests are mayhem, then...
Well, opening the borders and letting the migrants in and thinking just rejecting the whole idea of borders and nationality and culture and tradition and resisting the idea of marriage and having a meaningful life because you want to be... you have this fantasy left idea of that we all have to be radically equal and which is the way to mayhem. You have explained, not tomorrow, but that's the path you're taking. So that's what I mean by the left that is doing this, that is not in their own interests, I think. Because
it's not in the interests of what you'd expect someone to want if they wanted something good.
If they wanted to have a country where they were safe and live with people together, like we have a beautiful country here, I mean, but obviously this is not something they want to put first for themselves. They want to focus on an idea.
Well, mostly what resentment wants is to tear down. I had a friend who, years ago, who read all sorts of strange things. He was an odd guy. He was kind of an amateur anthropologist, and he read this book once. It was a Meditations on Resentment. That's not the name of the book, but that's basically what it was. And the guy who wrote it said that he had fantasized about hanging himself in the right position so that his swaying body would blot out his neighbor's sunlight. Oh. Yeah, well, that's resentment, That's resentment. And it really is bottomless. And
they want to be mean after they die. That's basically, they want to extend their...
Malevolence past the point of death. Yeah, right. Well, that's what the Columbine kids did.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a very good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what lives on after them.
It's not enough to make the environment during your life...
No, that's not enough.
For others, it has to extend.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. You got it. That's exactly right. And you think, well, why can people get that resentful? It's like, well, life is tragic and it's touched with malevolence. That's enough. Did
Hitler think that way? You think that he kept going on the last days and weeks of the war? He was in the shelter and he just let his men die?
Oh, sure. He thought, the historical record's quite clear. Hitler felt that he had been let down by the German people and it was fine that everything burned. Yeah. And you might say, if you were skeptical enough, that the burning was the point. You see, and I believe that. And I mean, things are multi-leveled, right? But the question is, well, what was animating Hitler, let's say? Well, you might say, well, it was Hitler himself. It's like, no, there was a dread spirit animating Hitler. And what was it after? Well, it was after Hitler's suicide in a bunker in 1945 with Europe in flames. That's what it was after. And that's what it got.
That was the aim, actually.
That was the aim. Yeah. You bet. That was the intent. Hitler was a singular personality, very creative, very assertive, and also very good at pattern recognition. It was part of his creativity. Okay, so now here's oh yes, he was a very creative person.
No, I knew that, but pattern.
Oh yes, well it's part of being creative, is to recognize patterns, to pick them up unconsciously. Because that's what an artist does, is pick up patterns unconsciously and then portray them, right? And in an attempt to make them conscious. That's part of the artistic process. Okay, so now he's brutalized, right? He went through trench warfare in World War I, and he's thwarted because he wanted to become an artist, and he applied to become an artist. I think it was in Vienna.
Yeah,
I think it was 3 times, and he was rejected all 3 times. Homeless. Many of his friends had been killed in World War I. It was brutal, and there's no evidence that he was a coward in World War I. He got a medal for valor, And if I remember correctly, there was one time in his life where he was in a trench warfare scene with his friends, and he wandered off away from them. And when he came back, a mortar had landed in the middle of the group and killed everyone. Now that does something to you psychologically as well, right? Because it makes you feel special, marked out, because you didn't die, but everyone else did, right? So anyways, so there's Hitler, and then he's surrounded by brutalized men, and Germany is completely demolished, and the economy is in shambles, and the communists are threatening, and it's like, and then of course there's hyperinflation, and the Germans all feel betrayed, and it's like it's a mess the magnitude of which we can barely even imagine. And so then he starts talking to people because he's not very happy. And he's willing to go where the crowd leads him. That's the thing. Now, the funny thing is that a good leader has a dialogue with the crowd. But a good leader isn't willing to go wherever the crowd wants to go. Okay. It's a dialogue, but not Hitler. It's not a dialogue precisely. Or if it is, it's a dialogue with a darker side of him. So this is what happens. So he stands in front of the crowd, and he has some oratorical ability. So he can captivate people. And because maybe he is one of those vessels through which the crowd can speak. So he says these sentences, nothing happens. Then he says these sentences, and he gets a bit of a rise out of the crowd. And then he says the same sentences, but he puts a flourish on them, and then it gets a real rise out of the crowd. And the little pattern recognition module in his mind thinks, okay, not so much of that, and quite a bit more of this. And so then he does that again, and he gets a little better at it. And so there's quite a bit more of the crowd-pleasing rhetoric, and the crowds get more enthusiastic. And he's watching and attending and shifting his behavior.
Is that the pattern? Like he's making the pattern of the
pattern is the pattern of the crowd's desire is manifesting itself in his imagination, and he's giving voice to it. The question is, well, what does the angry post-war German crowd want? So you could think of Hitler as the articulated embodiment of the maddened crowd, right? And then there's a dynamic, right? So the crowd broadcasts its resentment to the leader, and the leader says, oh, this is what you mean. And the crowd goes, yes, that's what we mean. And then they get more fired up, and the leader listens and recognizes the pattern and says, so this is what you want. And the crowd goes, yes. And it's a feedback loop, right? And he was very good at that. He was willing to use the gift of his voice in the service of the darkest desire of the maddened crowd. Well, it's like calling Satan himself up from the depths. That's a good enough metaphor, man. Unless someone can come up with a better one. Like, that's a good one.
Do we have a Satan that has come up from the depth in our time right now? Or because I don't see...
Not on that scale.
No.
Well, there's Kim Jong-un.
Okay.
You know. Yeah. He's quite the piece of work, and his whole dynasty. Well, you know, I think that's comparable. Look, I mean, the North Koreans have the third largest standing, I think it's the third largest standing army in the world. They are a major military force. So, you know, you think, oh, it's a comical little country. It's sort of tucked in the middle of nowhere. It's like, yeah, fair enough. But I think they have 7 million soldiers. You know, if North Korea decided to invade South Korea, the only way you would stop them was with nuclear weapons. Because they just invade, and that would be the end of it. You know, so...
And some people would say, well, Donald Trump has these abilities as well to get the...
Well, every politician has that ability to some degree, because they...
But I mean, that his aim is actually to make people stand up against each other and make... create...
Yeah, well, it's hard to say what Donald Trump's aim is. You know, it's hard to say what his aim is exactly. He's a very contradictory and complicated character. So, you know, and I mean, he's been in power for a year, and all hell hasn't broken loose.
It's a clash of liberals against... and it's getting worse with the day. It's like...
Yeah, well, it's not so new. I don't know if it's any worse than it was in the 60s.
Okay.
It was pretty rough around Nixon's time. You know, there was a big split, and that was pretty ugly. And it was pretty rough around Reagan and Thatcher. But
I do feel that the liberals or the left in the West is actually trying to stand up against the Trump and Trump voters and the right and the conservatives and the alt-right and everyone that they exclude from their ideological views. So this is something maybe not between in between, but maybe inside of the left that is becoming more and more a problem.
Well, there is...
Like they're making more censorship laws. We have this in Germany as well.
Oh, yeah,
Holland. And this is all coming from the mainstream, from the left.
Radical left,
the radical left.
The radical left has endless sins on its conscience. Well, you know, in France now it's illegal to put up a anti-abortion website. It's illegal.
Yeah.
It's just... Well, and Trudeau in Canada is proposing similar moves.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I don't care what the hell you have to say about abortion, but there's a debate to be had about it.
Yeah.
Because it is obviously one of those issues that stands on the moral divide, and for obvious reasons. It's like, well, there's two competing principles at war.
Yeah, but it analyzes the message of don't have kids, because in Germany, for instance, we have these articles that are about, well, if you have two babies instead of three, then you can
reduce your carbon footprint.
Exactly.
Oh God. Yeah.
I mean, can I do something else? I mean, to help, let me have my child. I mean, it's not like.
No, it's appalling. I find those sorts of things absolutely appalling. They are so anti-human.
Yeah.
It's like, well, you could save the planet by not having a child. It's like, you could save the planet by jumping off a cliff.
Yeah.
Right. So we'll let the child be born and you can just like perish. And then you can reduce your goddamn carbon footprint. Yeah, because it's anti-humanism masquerading as planetary compassion.
Exactly. It's in big ideas, it's in small things. This morning in my hotel room, I saw a little leaflet or it said, do something good for the planet, do something good for the world. It said, don't use your tub. Don't use tub, but don't clean your room. So I thought about your book.
Those things
clean your room first. Yeah. And I thought
those things really annoy me in hotels, because that's a really good example of people manipulating morality. Like you see that in every hotel room now. Well, if you we're using 50,000 tons of detergent a year, and if you just don't wash your towels today, it's like, well, you're not trying to save the goddamn planet. You're trying to save on laundry. And fine, like if you want to put a sign that says, look, man.
Everyone understands.
Yeah, well, you want to reuse your towels, would that be okay? It would help us on our cost end. I'd be way more likely to do that than to have this damn message about saving the planet.
Maybe let you respond to this. What part of the mess that we are in right now can we contribute to collective guilt? Like the feeling of that we have. We talked about the Germans a little bit. They have the guilt for the war, for the victims of the war, for what happened to the Jews. But it seems like
original sin was an attempt to kind of deal with that. It's like you could say, I think, psychologically that people feel guilty.
Yeah.
It's just how it is. People feel guilty.
That is for often the motivation to do something good.
Yeah.
It's because we have this built-in guilt.
Yeah, it's existential guilt.
Existential guilt. Where does it come from? Because it could be the death of God.
That's a very good question. Well, I think part of the reason that you have existential guilt is because you're not all you could be, and neither is everything else. So when you look out in the world, you see, or inward for that matter, you see a set of unsolved problems that could be addressed if you just were a little bit better than you are.
Okay.
And so
that seems a little bit narcissistic, like you are responsible to solve all these problems by yourself. I mean, it's
the by yourself part is a problem. Because if you start thinking that way, then it becomes crushing, and it can become narcissistic in the negative sort of manner, right?
Yeah.
But you're responsible for solving these problems, but not necessarily by yourself.
No.
And that's a really good thing to know. Is like you should take on the burden, but other people. It's okay if other people help, man.
By yourself.
Yeah, and that's very important. So I mean, the Catholic doctrine at least gave a locale to that guilt. It said, oh well, people are universally guilty because our ancestors, our fundamental ancestors did something wrong, and we've never recovered from it. It's it's a brilliant formulation, I think, because that is actually what happened, is our ancestors woke up and became aware of the future, and we've never recovered from it.
No.
So, and that is what distinguishes us from animals. So there was a core element to the idea of original sin that was just psychologically dead on. Well, and then the question was, okay, well, what's the antidote to original sin? That's the fundamental question in the Bible, essentially, is, okay, well, there's the fall of man. What do we do about it? And the answer is something like voluntarily bear the weight of tragic being and tell the truth. That's your best bet. And that answer is satisfying to me. I think it's true enough. It's true enough to implement. But more than that, one of the things that's so interesting, and this has especially been the case now that so many people are coming to talk to me about their experiences, like tens of thousands of people, literally, because they all say the same thing. I don't get letters from people saying, well, you know, I started cleaning up my room and telling the truth, and my life has fallen apart and everything's in absolute chaos, and I wish you'd go to hell, you son of a bitch. For that never happens, you know. Well, it's strange because it could. What happens instead is people write and they say, well, you know, I started trying to be more careful with what I was saying and to say what I think, and I've been trying to sort myself out and clean up my room, and things are so much better that I can't believe it. And then they write me and tell me that. It's like, so it's not like this is just some casual theory. And if you're a psychotherapist, well, psychotherapy, the process of psychotherapy is predicated on the idea that shared conversational truth is redemptive. It's very funny because clinical psychology is an unbelievably Christian, what would you call it? It's an unbelievably Christian practice because it's predicated on the idea that shared spoken truth is redemptive. So, I mean, you see this really obviously with people like Carl Rogers, who was a great clinician. I mean, he was a missionary to begin with, and he became a secular humanist, but he didn't drop any of his fundamental Christian presuppositions that the truthful spoken word was redemptive. It's built so deeply into psychotherapy that there's just no getting out of it. And the other part of psychotherapy is face what you're afraid of and disgusted by. Yeah, well, those two things, I mean, those are the core elements of the hero mythology, essentially. And it works. It works. It's not just...
But those are all things that are not built into our society, which is about having fun, about being successful, about being busy, especially.
Yeah.
Facing things, I mean,
well, that's
why,
right.
Why should I do that? I can watch Netflix.
Why should I do that?
Fine.
Well, that's right. That is but that is the right question.
Yeah.
Why should I do that? Well, the answer is the flood is coming, and your ark better be prepared.
And I feel that people do wake up now. They want to become more politically active, or they want to read more, and they turn off the TV, but they still don't know really what to do. Mm-hmm. What can I do? Mm-hmm. They tell me, I write articles. They tell me, I like to read your articles, but what can I do? What should I do? I don't know. So there's a gap now between realizing that they have to become more active and the things that their options.
Well, we could say more responsible.
Yeah.
And you could say that maybe the drive towards activism is a warped attempt to do that. That's what it looks like to me.
Because young people are falling into that trap. They want to become activists.
They want to do something. They want to do something good with their life. Yes. You know, I mean, some of it's driven by resentment, as we've already pointed out, but some of it is driven by the desire to do something.
So what water can we lead them to? Like what are the other? I say we because I feel like I don't know. I do feel like like a country. We need to do this together. So what can we do for these young people?
Yeah, well, that's what the 12 Rules for Life is about.
Yeah,
right?
So give them the book, basically.
Well, that's it's a treatise on why you should do something better than amuse yourself with Netflix. I don't have anything against Netflix or against stories for that matter. That's not the issue. It's that, but the real question is why bother? In the face of tragedy and evil, why bother? That's the question. It's like, yeah, good question, man. That's a good question. It's like, well, because you can overcome it. You can minimize it. You can restrict it. You can bring great things into being. You can bring beautiful things into being. Right? You can be I had another guy come up to me the other day. This was a good one. Because one of the suggestions that I've made to people is that for men in particular, although it's not limited to men, is that you should try to be the person who's reliable at your father's funeral.
Yes.
And he said, well, last year my father died and I didn't know what the hell to do, so I decided that I'd try to be the one that everyone could rely on during the funeral. He said that worked like a charm. He said people could rely on me and I knew what to do. And I thought, Jesus, great, man. Like, that's a tough situation.
But at least you have a task. You don't just have to grieve.
You got a task.
Yeah,
that's right,
it's
man.
better than grief.
It is.
Grief is just
Or at least it's an antidote to the grief. It's like you got the grief still, but you got something to do. You can comfort some other people. It's something when there's nothing. Because at a funeral is when there's nothing. There's nothing to say, right? You hit the limit.
No.
So what do? Well, you try to be the person who's there to make it not quite as bad as it has to be.
Yeah, great. It's such great advice. So where is this path taking you the next few years, you think? What are your plans?
Oh, well, you know, what are my plans? I don't really have any plans for the next few years. Well, it's too unpredictable.
I think it's walking away with you a little bit at this point.
Not a little bit.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, I've watched these videos.
You've put something in motion. It's just rolling
That's
out
right.
like this.
That's right. Well,
That's
and
amazing.
so I'm surfing a 500-foot wave.
Really, yeah.
And hopefully, well, I watched these videos and I wrote about it a little bit, 12 Rules for Life. Watch these kids, the parkour kids and the sky crane climbers and the crazy stunt people and the people who surf 100-foot waves. You know, I watch those videos and I see people dealing with these dynamic situations that are, you know, where catastrophe can break loose at any moment. It's like, well, that's what I'm doing.
So it's like surfing a wave. So it's also very, because you have said at one point, I'm really conscious of what I say, and sometimes I'm afraid that I might say something.
No, not sometimes.
All the time.
Yes, definitely. Oh, absolutely.
But I'm so curious. But
look at what happened with Channel 4.
Yes.
Jesus, there's 2 million people have watched that. It's like that was a great place. That was a Shark Tank. I just had to say one stupid thing.
But that had like the Lindsey Shepherd sort of revelation behind it, I think, that people really saw clearly what's going on there.
Yeah.
Like
great.
The reason on the left and the feminist ideology on the right, like coming together like black and white. That was the case, like with Lindsey Shepherd. But what would that, of course you won't say literally, but what would that be? Something that you would say that would perhaps just...
Oh, it could be any number of things. Like I could make a careless joke. Okay. You know, I mean...
Is it that little?
It could be. Yeah. Or I could respond improperly to someone on Twitter and get in a little war. Or I mean, I'm a little more protected than I was a year ago because there's a lot of positive momentum behind me. So maybe it would be, maybe I would be forgiven an error or two, but I wouldn't count on it. You know, and I've already many times already in the last year, if I've said anything that, well, I can give you an example. So about 3 months ago, my neighborhood was blanketed by these posters.
I brought it.
Yeah, and the poster is quite the thing because, you know, the person, that's the one. Community safety, it's a work of art, this thing.
Because this is so different than from the online harassment that you have received.
Oh yeah, well this is
real, you can feel it, it's on the tree, you know.
It's a work of malicious brilliance.
Exactly.
About a block away from where I live, there's a big rock in a park. Yeah. And the person who had posted these, I know who it is, because the person's relative wrote me and told me who was doing it. Right. So there's a big rock out in our park, and they completely covered it. They covered totally, like the telephone poles and all sorts of places in my neighborhood. Yeah. And so, first of all, there's a hotline to my employer, so that's cool. And then the next thing is community safety bulletin, so that's sort of a sexual predator thing. And then there's an immediate accusation that I've been campaigning against the human rights of women, people of color, Muslims, and LGBT people. I have open associations with neo-Nazis, and that I've been referred to as a Nazi philosopher by the leader of the new Constitution, which they spelt wrong, by the way, Constitution Party of Canada. It's like a party no one's ever heard of, and God only knows what that means, but it doesn't matter. It's a work of art, but even more intelligently. Well, this is such a funny picture because this is a picture taken from the free speech rally.
You had no microphone.
I had no microphone, so I was like raising my voice so that I could be heard over the white noise. Not only did I have no microphone, but they were broadcasting white noise. So they took this picture that makes me look like, you know, a carnivorous, carnivorous white male, basically. And
for the listeners, because you were talking here about the importance of
free speech. Yeah. And so it's just, so then what happened was the person who had produced these posters put it up on their Facebook site. And so I tweeted the Facebook site. And then I also tweeted the same day the Facebook site of a So the same person had organized their followers well enough to shut down a free speech panel that was going to be held at Ryerson University. And then afterwards they came out and celebrated in the streets, but they came out under the banner of the hammer and sickle, which I regard as a move no less unacceptable, let's say, than coming out under the banner of the swastika, although people often don't see it that way. I see it that way. And so I tweeted the fact that this person had a Facebook page and that they were, perversely enough, also a business student at a local college, which I thought was really comical. It's like, really, you're a hammer and sickle bearing communist in a business program. It's like, how clueless can you get? So I tweeted these two things, the Facebook pages, and since then I've been accused of doxing my students. So that's how that got spun. A, they weren't my students. B, I didn't dox them. And, well, as far as I was concerned, it was like, well, what I was doing was providing public information about the nature of the people who were up to these shenanigans.
And you do this often online. You fight back. If someone attacks you online, you should choose your battles but
choose them carefully.
But do battle it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the thing. Is like, what are the rules? Don't make unnecessary enemies. You choose your battles judiciously. Don't hit back any harder than you have to. That's a tough one, eh? You win the conversation when you both come away from the conversation smarter than you were when you went into the conversation. That's how you win.